My name is Riley, I'm 28 years old, and if anyone had ever asked me what the happiest day of my life was, I used to answer without hesitation, my wedding day. Last June, under the golden sunset of Napa Valley, I stood beneath an arch draped in white orchids, hand in hand with the man I believed was the love of my life, Mason. It looked like a painting. Twinkling string lights hung perfectly between the trees, soft violin music echoed through the air. Our family and friends were all there, smiling, crying tears of joy as we exchanged vows. Mason looked at me with his sparkling blue eyes like we were the only two people in the world. He said all the words I'd once dreamed of hearing, that he'd love me in all circumstances, through sunshine and storms, in wealth or in hardship. I nodded through tears, heart pounding with happiness. We moved into a small house near Seattle. 2 bedrooms, a backyard just big enough for some lavender and summer tomatoes. I spent every weekend cleaning, decorating, picking out artwork and throw blankets, believing I was building a true home. Mason kept working at the same software company he'd been with for years, and I freelanced from home writing marketing content. Every day I waited for the sound of the door opening, his voice calling, "I'm home!" and the familiar soft scent of his cologne. One time I even sketched out a nursery on paper and hid it in my nightstand drawer. We used to talk about kids all the time. Mason once said, "I want to be a dad before 30, a kid who looks like you." Brown hair, bright smile. I had hugged him tight, believing that dream would come true in just a few months. But then things started to change. Not suddenly, but gradually, like a song shifting keys. Talks about the future faded during dinner. I mentioned a friend who'd just had a baby, and Mason just mumbled and turned to check basketball scores on his phone. I gently suggested maybe we could try a little earlier. He gave a dry laugh and said it wasn't the right time. Silence started settling between us like a heavy fog. I still cooked dinner every night, still rested my hand on my belly imagining a tiny life, but he was different. He came home later, often with excuses about extra work, but I began noticing his shirt smelled like cologne I didn't own. One time, I found a receipt from a downtown restaurant we'd never been to together. I tried to tell myself I was just being overly sensitive. Everyone gets tired after work. But I couldn't shake the feeling in his eyes. They no longer looked at me like that day in Napa. They looked through me. Like I was no longer part of the picture he was painting. I started counting how many times he touched me each week. Once, then not at all. The nursery sketch sat quietly at the bottom of the drawer. And I, the woman who had once been promised love no matter what, began to ask myself, what do promises mean if the person who made them no longer holds them? I found out I was pregnant on a Tuesday morning, a morning that felt ordinary but changed everything. I didn't believe the 2 faint pink lines at first. I stared at them for 5 minutes, then sat silently on the bathroom floor, hands trembling. My heart pounded in my chest, not out of fear, but because of overwhelming emotion. Because the hope I once poured into those old sketches was now becoming real. All day I kept touching my stomach, scared and thrilled at once. I couldn't feel anything yet, but I knew something was beginning, a tiny life, fragile but heartbreakingly real. I prepared a small gift for Mason, a simple wooden box with a lid, inside it the cleaned pregnancy test wrapped in a white cloth, and a tiny pair of knitted baby socks I bought on Etsy. I wrote on the lid, "We're about to become 3. That evening Mason came home late like always. I waited to eat with him, but he just said he already had dinner with coworkers and scrolled through his phone as I served the chicken soup he used to love. I didn't get upset, I just said, "I have something I want to give you." He frowned but sat down. I handed him the box. He opened it, looked, said nothing. Then suddenly he laughed. But it wasn't warm or happy. It was cold, dry laughter that made my chest tighten. "Seriously, Riley," he said flatly, "you really did this?" I blinked. "I thought you'd be happy. You said—" "I've said a lot of things." He stood up, placed the box on the table. "But you knew now's not the time. And you still did this. Why, to trap me?" "To trap you?" I repeated, stunned. "You know," Mason looked me dead in the eye, no gentleness left. "Things haven't been great between us. You think a baby's going to fix that?" I stood frozen in the kitchen, hands clenched so tightly they went numb. I didn't do this. This is our child. And I'm not trying to trap anyone. Mason just sighed, turned away, mumbled something I couldn't catch, then grabbed his coat and walked out. No hug, no other word. The door shut behind him, leaving me alone in the kitchen light, next to baby socks no one had touched. The days that followed were thick with silence. Mason still came home, but later, colder. I started noticing things I didn't want to believe. Uber receipts from strange places, strong perfume on his shirts that wasn't mine, and fleeting messages from someone named Elki, saved with a heart emoji. I used to think I'd never go through my husband's phone, but in that moment all I had left was instinct, and it was screaming. One night while Mason was showering, a message popped up. "You're not coming again today? I miss you." I didn't feel shock, just emptiness. I couldn't sleep. I lay facing the wall, holding my stomach, whispering, "I'm sorry, baby, but I'll protect you, even if it's just me." 3 days later, Mason said he needed space, that he'd stay with a friend for a few days to think. When he wheeled his suitcase to the door, I didn't beg him to stay. I only asked, "Do you even want to be a father?" He looked at me, longer than I expected, then answered curtly, "Depends, if it's really mine." I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I just stood there, watching the man who once swore he'd never leave me walk out of everything we'd built. I closed the door, locked it, then walked back inside, sat on the couch by instinct, hand resting on my belly. Inside me was the only thing left, and the only reason I knew I couldn't fall apart. I came home from my first prenatal appointment alone, holding a black and white ultrasound showing a tiny forming shape, a small heart beating inside me. The house was eerily quiet. Mason had come back while I was gone. I knew because his suitcase was no longer in the closet. Half his clothes were gone, drawers empty. On the kitchen counter sat a note, scribbled in pen, folded in half. "Don't contact me, figure it out yourself." No explanation, no meeting, just a cold sentence, ending it all like I was a torn-out page from a notebook he no longer wanted. I collapsed into a kitchen chair, clutching the note, my stomach churning not from hunger but from hollow ache. I called my mom 3 times, no answer. She was off vacationing with her new husband and had once told me, "You chose who you married, so deal with the consequences." I texted Annie, my college best friend, the one who was my bridesmaid. The message showed seen for 2 hours before she finally replied. "I'm sorry, I don't want to be caught in the middle. I hope you're okay." Caught in the middle? I couldn't believe I was reading that from the person who hugged me all night before my wedding because she worried I was overwhelmed. In the following days, my contact list thinned with every short reply. Some said they were busy, some never answered at all. A few even unfollowed me on social media after I posted the ultrasound picture. The 2-bedroom apartment had become nothing more than a hollow space. I still cooked out of habit, even though no one came home for dinner. I still listened for the sound of the key turning in the lock, still glanced at the coat hook where Mason used to hang his jacket. But nothing ever happened. The fridge slowly emptied. My bank statement didn't lie. I had exactly $2,143.00 left after paying utilities and the mortgage. My health insurance only covered part of my prenatal care. I updated my resume and applied to every freelance job I could find, writing, editing, even transcribing. I used to think I was strong, but one night sitting in the living room with my belly showing beneath a stretched t-shirt, I burst into tears when a stainless steel spoon fell to the floor, and there was no one to help pick it up. The next day I received a notice from the apartment management. Mason had submitted a request to remove his name from the lease. I was now the sole tenant and the full rent going forward was my responsibility. They even attached a copy of the email Mason sent with the line, "I no longer reside at this address, please update your records." I felt like I'd been erased from the life of the man who once held my hand in front of 200 guests and said, "Forever." With no other choice, I converted Mason's old room into a temporary office. I wrote ad copy for handmade soap while battling morning sickness, eyes stinging from exhaustion, with the scent of dish soap from that morning still lingering in the air. One chilly afternoon I decided to text Mason. Not to beg, just to ask one question. "Are you planning to take responsibility for this baby?" He replied exactly 1 minute later. I'm not sure it's mine, don't contact me again. For the first time in my life, my hands shook so hard I couldn't press the button to lock my phone screen. That night, I pulled our wedding album from the drawer, the one I used to treasure. I flipped through each page. The way he looked at me, held my hand, smiled like he meant it. And now, all of it just made me feel like I'd been part of an elaborate performance. I didn't burn it, I simply wrapped it up and placed it in the attic, because I knew from that day on, my life no longer needed anything that only looked perfect. I needed something real, for me, and for the unborn child I swore I would never abandon. Rent was due in 2 weeks. I stared at the orange notice taped to the door, bold letters reading, "Late payment warning," like it was shouting in my face. You're about to lose everything. My bank balance showed $726.00. Insurance had denied coverage for my 20-week blood test, claiming it was unnecessary at this stage. My next prenatal appointment was already scheduled, non-negotiable. I sat at my old laptop using the free Wi-Fi from the cafe across the street, sending out dozens of applications each day. Every website looked the same, "We'll contact you if there's a fit." No one called. But I didn't give up. I wrote blog posts for hire, edited documents for international students, even polished resumes for $25.00 apiece. Every dollar I made now wasn't just money, it was a promise to my child. At night, I didn't turn on the hallway lights to save on electricity. I ate instant noodles, boiled frozen vegetables, sometimes toasted discounted bread, but I never cut corners for my baby. I bought the best prenatal vitamins I could afford, ordered a used crib through a baby gear resale app, even though it was missing some slats and needed the screws tightened. I didn't care. I was going to make it a safe, cozy space for my baby. One weekend afternoon, I took out my toolbox and spread everything on the floor. The instruction manual was faded, the screws didn't match exactly, but I sat there tightening them one by one. My belly had grown so much that bending over was hard. Every time my back ached, I paused, placed a hand on my stomach and whispered, "I'm doing this for you, I can do this." After 3 hours, the crib was done, not perfect, but sturdy enough for me to believe my baby would be safe in it. I stood up, stepped back, and pictured my baby lying there, sleeping soundly, tiny hands reaching out for warmth. That image made me cry, not from sadness, but because for the first time, I truly felt like a mother. That night, while editing a manuscript for a client in Denver, I received an email from a small startup. "We're impressed with your writing skills. You can start next week as a remote content writer." I screamed. No one heard, but that didn't matter. I had just landed my first steady freelance contract since Mason left. The pay wasn't high, but it was enough to get by. A few days later, while folding donated baby clothes from a local charity, there was a knock at the door. I opened it. Linda, the woman from downstairs who used to scold me for making noise on Sunday mornings, was standing there with a paper bag. "Riley," she said, "I heard some things around the building. I'm not trying to pry, but if you need anything, I have some of my granddaughter's old things. They might help." I almost cried but just smiled and nodded. As she walked away, I watched her. Her frame was stiff, but her hands carried more kindness than I ever expected to find in this place. That night, I rearranged everything in the second bedroom, now officially the baby's room. The tiny dresser held a few bodysuits, a knitted blanket, some worn-out stuffed animals. The room wasn't fancy, not pastel painted, no fancy light fixture, but it was built with my own hands, with sleepless nights, and every dollar earned through relentless effort. I still didn't know what the future would hold. The freelance contract was only for 3 months. Bills kept coming. Mason still hadn't asked once about the baby. But in all that uncertainty, one thing remained absolutely clear. I would never let my child grow up feeling abandoned. I'll never forget that morning, the morning when things seemed like they were finally settling, and then the world came crashing down again. The knocking on the door was loud and urgent. I hadn't even gotten out of bed when I heard a man's voice clearly through the wooden door. "Ms. Riley Thompson, you've been summoned to court." I opened the door, heart pounding. The man handed me a thick envelope, his eyes not unkind but without any trace of empathy. I took it, frozen, as he turned and walked away. I sat on the couch, pulling out each page. A court summons from Mason. Reason: request for DNA testing to establish legal rights and obligations. And worse? He accused me of fabricating a pregnancy for financial gain, causing harm to the plaintiff's reputation and public image. I had to read that line 3 times before I could even process it. Mason's the same man who once held me and said, "I can't wait for someone to call you Mom," was now calling the child inside me a lie? I had no more tears to cry, I just felt cold. Not because I was afraid of court, but because for the first time I understood what it meant to have the truth twisted into something unrecognizable. I held my belly, looked at the crib by the window. It had once symbolized hope. In that moment it became a reminder that I wasn't just fighting for myself, but for a life that couldn't yet speak up in its own defense. I didn't have money for a lawyer, I had no wealthy relatives or powerful friends, but I had something Mason didn't. The truth. I gathered every message, every doctor's appointment, every ultrasound bill, even a voice recording from the day we found out I was pregnant. Mason's own voice saying, "I still can't believe I'm going to be a dad." That was real joy, real emotion. And I had saved it instinctively, never knowing it might one day be evidence. A week later I took the bus to the northern suburbs where Mason's parents lived. I'd never been close to them, but I thought, surely they would care about their grandchild. The white gate opened on my second ring. Elaine Mason's mother stepped out. Her hair was perfectly styled, makeup subtle, but her expression colder than any winter I'd ever felt. "Riley," she said, voice faltering slightly when she saw my very obvious bump. "I'm not here to cause trouble," I began calmly. "I just wanted to talk, at least, for the baby's sake." She folded her arms, standing at the doorway, not inviting me in. "I think Mason made himself clear. He says it's not his." I was stunned. "But you used to say you wanted grandkids, you toasted our wedding, said you couldn't wait to hear a baby's laughter in the house." "I used to believe that," she interrupted, expression blank. "But after what Mason's told me, I don't know what to believe." "You don't have to believe me," I said, lips trembling. "Just ask yourself this. Would a pregnant, broke, homeless woman really make something up just to get taken to court?" She said nothing, just turned away and muttered quickly, "I think you should go, before the neighbors see and start asking questions." I stepped back onto the sidewalk, not looking back. I didn't want her to see me cry. Honestly, I didn't need her to. I only needed one thing, justice. When I got home, I organized all the paperwork into a neat folder. I labeled it with a black marker. Evidence, not just words. I knew I was about to step into a battle that wouldn't be easy, but I hadn't broken when my husband left. I hadn't given up when my friends turned away. And now, I wasn't going to let lies shake me. Because if Mason could so easily deny a child who hadn't even been born, then I, the only mother that child had, would stand tall, face everything, and speak the truth. The day I stepped into the hearing room, the Seattle sky was as gray as usual, but my heart had never felt so clear. In my bag was a nearly 50-page file. Everything I had collected over the last 3 months. Prenatal results, appointments, messages, recordings, and even the handwritten note Mason gave me one January night that read, "I can't wait for the day I get to be called Dad." I wore a plain black dress, not to impress but to remind myself that today was serious. This was no longer about me and Mason. This was about a mother standing up for her unborn child. Mason walked into the courtroom in a dark blue suit, shoes polished to a shine, flanked by his private attorney, a tall, silver-haired man with sharp eyes. I recognized the type instantly. Never said more than necessary, hired for one purpose only, to twist the truth. The hearing began with Mason's lawyer presenting his side. He spoke fluently and clearly, painting me as unstable, unemployed, and fabricating a pregnancy to trap his client. I stayed silent. I didn't react. I had prepared for this. When it was my turn, the judge, a woman in her early 50s with silver-rimmed glasses, asked if I had anything to present to the court. I stood up and handed over my documents, hands steady. "I have concrete evidence, text messages, appointment records, ultrasounds that list the father's name, and an audio recording from the day we found out I was pregnant." He expressed his feelings and even discussed baby names. The judge took the folder and flipped through the pages. She didn't say anything, just nodded lightly, as if mentally noting each piece. "The court grants the request for a DNA test," she said afterward, looking straight at Mason. It is a fundamental right to establish responsibility, and responsibility cannot be denied with mere words. Mason glanced at his lawyer, his face noticeably paler. The smirk he wore earlier had disappeared. I walked out of court with a different feeling. I hadn't won, but the truth had held its ground, and I knew I was no longer alone. That night, something unexpected happened. While I was typing an article for a new content project, I received a message from an unfamiliar account named Denise L. The message simply said, "I know Mason Dalton, and I believe you." I frowned. Denise? We met at a small cafe near Capitol Hill. She was a woman in her early 40s, dark curly hair, wearing a beige trench coat and carrying a folder. Her eyes were calm, but there was a sharpness in them. Like she'd walked through fires I had only just begun to feel. "I was involved with Mason," she began, her voice low but clear. "6 years ago. I was pregnant too, denied just like you, dragged into court too." I was speechless. "I didn't have evidence back then," she continued, pulling out a USB drive. "But I saved emails, recorded phone calls, and kept a handwritten journal. I didn't get to use them. I miscarried from the stress." My hands tightened under the table. Denise placed the USB drive in front of me. "I don't need him to pay for what he did to me," she said. "But if anyone can make him face the truth, it's you. And that child." I took the USB. My hands weren't shaking from fear but from emotion. A week later, I submitted a request to the court to admit third-party evidence. It wasn't easy. Courts usually don't accept testimony from unrelated individuals. But I included a detailed letter explaining this wasn't just emotional narrative. This was systematic proof of repeated behavior, real harm, and the risk of ongoing harm if left unchecked. 4 days later, I received a letter of confirmation. The court agreed to review the supplemental evidence at the next hearing. I sat quietly in the baby's room, the crib still there, the soft quilt Denise had given me neatly folded inside. I gently ran my fingers over the ultrasound picture taped to the wall. I didn't know when the DNA results would arrive. I didn't know what else Mason might pull. But I knew this. I was no longer walking alone. And the truth doesn't need makeup to stand tall. It only needs to be spoken, clearly, firmly, and without apology. The final hearing took place on a strangely clear morning in early October. I entered the courtroom 35 weeks pregnant, my breathing a bit heavier, but my mind light. I carried an old canvas bag, not just filled with legal files but also the recording of Mason saying he couldn't wait to be a dad, and the USB Denise had bravely handed me. Mason arrived a few minutes late, same tailored suit, neatly combed hair, and his lawyer beside him. But this time his face wasn't composed. His eyes darted when he saw me, and when he saw the judge's expression, no longer patient with theatrics. The judge opened the session by announcing that the DNA results had been processed and would be read into the official record. The courtroom went still. "Based on the biological samples collected and analyzed from both parties," she read from the file without lifting her eyes, "the results confirm Mason Dalton is the biological father of the child carried by the plaintiff, Riley Thompson." I closed my eyes for a second, not because I was surprised, but because what I'd known all along, what I had been forced to prove like a defendant, was now confirmed, clearly and undeniably. Mason's lawyer jumped up, flipping through documents, about to speak, but the judge raised her hand, her voice icy. "We're not finished." She turned to another file, the evidence I had submitted. In addition to attempting to deny responsibility for his biological child, the defendant is accused of making false statements with the intent to defame the plaintiff. Testimony from third-party witness Denise Lawson, including emails, audio recordings, and written declarations, aligned fully with the defendant's current behavior. Mason began glancing around the courtroom. His face shifted, not confident, not defiant, just unraveling. I could see it in every shallow breath. The judge continued. "Based on the evidence presented, and the plaintiff's testimony, the court finds that the defendant has willfully evaded responsibility and caused emotional, financial, and reputational harm to the plaintiff. Therefore, the court orders the following. The defendant must pay monthly child support beginning at the child's birth through their 18th birthday. The defendant is liable for prenatal medical expenses, emotional damages, and all legal fees the plaintiff incurred. The defendant is prohibited from making any public statements that are defamatory or misleading regarding this case. The courtroom was heavy with silence. Mason sat with his head down, hands clenched on the table. I knew he was trying to hold himself together, but I could feel the collapse in every unsteady breath. I didn't feel joy, I didn't feel vindicated, I just felt free. Justice didn't take me back to who I was, but it gave me and my baby a new starting point, one built on truth, not denial. As I exited the courthouse, I saw Mason's attorney storming off toward the parking lot, his face like ice. Mason stood alone at the end of the hallway. No lawyer, no composure. He looked at me. A glance that seemed to want to say something, but I didn't stop. I kept walking past the courthouse doors into the brilliant golden sunlight of fall. I pulled out my phone and texted Denise. The truth is out, my baby and I are no longer shadows. It showed read just seconds later, followed by a single heart. That was all, but it was enough to remind me I hadn't fought this battle alone. That night I sat on my bed, hand on my belly, feeling the gentle kicks inside. I opened a drawer, pulled out a blank sheet of paper, and wrote the first line of a journal I would one day give to my child. My love, today your mom stood up, and because of that you'll grow up in truth, not silence. I folded the page, slid it into an envelope, and labeled it. The day truth won, not your father, but the truth. 2 weeks after the hearing, I received an unexpected email from the court-appointed legal liaison, Marissa Lane. During the trial, she was the only one who looked at me not just with professionalism but with understanding. She wrote, "Riley, if you're open to it, I'd like to invite you to visit the Summit Haven Legal Support Center. There are many here who've been left behind, who've had to prove their worth against accusations, and I think you have something they need, a real voice, unafraid." I read that email no less than 5 times. I wasn't a lawyer, not a specialist, I was just a mother who'd weathered her own storm. But maybe that's exactly why I understood what it felt like to stand alone in a courthouse hallway, pregnant, heartbroken. I went to Summit Haven on a Tuesday morning, bringing my medical records, court documents, and the notes I'd written just to keep myself from falling apart. The center was on the 3rd floor of a modest building with a small waiting room, a few old wooden chairs, and a bulletin board filled with handwritten notes. Marissa shook my hand firmly. She didn't ask much. She just said, "You don't need to do anything big. Just tell it exactly how you lived it. That's enough." At my first talk during a workshop for newly single mothers, I understood what she meant. I told my story. My voice trembled at first, but the more I spoke, the quieter the room grew. The women didn't look at me as a victim. They nodded, held hands, and looked at me as if hearing their own hearts speak. I started volunteering at the center 2 days a week, helping lead support groups and assisting moms who couldn't afford lawyers fill out legal forms. I no longer felt defined by pain. Instead, I began to see the value in everything I had endured. Not to relive it, but to light the way for someone else. Then on a misty November morning, I went into labor. No Mason, no message from his family, and none needed. It was just me, a young nurse named Lexi, and a compassionate OBGYN. The pain lasted nearly 10 hours. There were moments I wanted to give up. But then I remembered Marissa's eyes, Denise's hand on mine the night she gave me that USB, the tiny heartbeat on that first ultrasound, and I kept going. And then, with one deep breath and the most beautiful sound I had ever heard, my baby cried for the first time. A baby girl. Her skin was rosy, her soft black hair fine as silk, and her tiny hand clutched at my gown the second they placed her on my chest. I broke down crying, overcome by a peace I'd never known before. Not because I'd won, but because the purest kind of love had arrived. I named her Isla, the name I had written in a small notebook the moment I found out I was pregnant, a gentle name meaning island, because she had been my refuge in the storm. We came home 3 days later. No party, no congratulations. But my little apartment had never felt warmer. The crib by the window finally had someone to hold. I hung a small paper lantern above it and wrote my first promise to her. You will grow up in truth, in love, and never as a burden. One afternoon while I was nursing Isla, I got a call from Summit Haven. Marissa invited me to join part-time as a support group coordinator. We don't need someone perfect, she said. We need someone who stood in the dark and chose to light a candle instead of cursing it. I said yes without hesitation. Life after the trial wasn't covered in roses. There were still nights I woke up from haunting memories, still days when my budget felt stretched to its limit. But I was no longer living to survive, I was living to build. I didn't seek revenge. I didn't speak ill of Mason. I simply moved forward, leaving the truth behind me like a mark that couldn't be erased. Because I knew some victories don't need applause. They just need a newborn cry and a mother's arms, ready to hold. That afternoon the weather turned suddenly cold. Rain tapped gently against the living room window. I had just rocked Isla to sleep when the doorbell rang. 2 short, firm chimes, unfamiliar. I wasn't expecting anyone. Neighbors usually knocked. People from Summit Haven always texted first. I held Isla close, stepped quietly to the door, and peeked through the peephole. The woman standing there made me take half a step back. Oh, I'm Mason's mother. A light gray fur coat hung damp across her shoulders from the drizzle. She no longer looked as polished and elegant as the last time I saw her, when she shut me out behind that pristine white gate. Her face looked pale, but her eyes, those eyes no longer held the avoidance I once saw. I opened the door slowly. Isla slept soundly in my arms, her breath soft, like a whispered reminder of peace. "Hello, Riley," she said first, her voice deeper than I remembered. I know I shouldn't be here, but if you could spare me a minute, I'd be grateful." I said nothing. Part of me wanted to close the door just like she once did to me. But then I looked at Isla. My daughter deserved to grow up free from the weight of things left unsaid. I nodded and stepped aside, signaling her to come in. We sat in the living room. I placed Isla in the bassinet beside me and gently rocked her back to sleep. Elaine sat across from me, her hands clasped tightly, eyes not on me, but on the crib where my daughter lay peacefully. "She looks so much like Mason," she whispered. I didn't respond. "Mason didn't tell me everything," she continued. "It wasn't until the court ruling that I learned the truth. Not from him, but from someone who happened to be there. And when I read the news coverage, I felt ashamed. Not of what my son did, but of myself, for choosing to believe the wrong person." I stayed silent. The anger I once felt was no longer sharp like a blade, but it still smoldered, like a fire not yet out. "I read the letter you sent Mason and the words you said in court," she said, her voice catching. "I don't know if you'll believe this, but I truly looked forward to holding my grandchild. And yet, I turned my back when it mattered most." For the first time, she looked me in the eye. "I'm not here to justify anything. I just want to say I'm sorry. And if you'll allow it, I'd like to meet Isla. Just once. If you say no, I'll leave right now." I looked down at Isla. She was still asleep, her tiny hand resting near the edge of her blanket, eyelids fluttering gently. I remembered Elaine's eyes at the gate, cold, resolute, and her eyes today, tired but sincere. I nodded slowly. She leaned toward the bassinet, not to pick Isla up, just to look. Her eyes reddened and tears began to fall silently down her cheeks. "I'm sorry I didn't believe your mother," she whispered, barely audible. In that moment, I didn't forgive her. But I no longer felt the need to punish her either. Because I understood, sometimes people take longer to arrive at the truth. And just as I once needed someone to give me a chance, today I chose to give that back. Not for her, but for Isla. Every child deserves to grow up surrounded by love, even from those who once made mistakes. As she stood to leave, she paused at the door and asked, "May I visit sometime?" "Not often, just if you're okay with it." I didn't answer right away. I just said, "I won't close the door, but everything takes time." She nodded. "I understand. Thank you, Riley." The door closed behind her. But this time, there was no feeling of abandonment or being cast aside. I turned to Isla, kissed her forehead and whispered, "We don't get to choose where we start, but we can choose how we write the rest." Every morning as sunlight filters through the little window in our second-floor apartment and Isla giggles in her crib, I'm reminded that life, after everything, is a kind of miracle. I no longer count pennies in my wallet, no longer lie awake wondering if I'll have enough for formula tomorrow, not because I won the lottery or someone rescued me, but because I chose to stand up, and brick by brick I rebuilt my life with trust and grit. After starting work at Summit Haven as a group coordinator, I was invited to speak at a seminar for single mothers who had experienced divorce or abandonment. At first I declined, partly from shyness, partly because I didn't believe my voice carried much weight. But Marissa said one thing that changed my mind. "Riley, no one wants a story like yours, but a lot of people need to hear it." I stepped onto the small community center stage, hands freezing, heart pounding loud enough to hear. But when I looked out at the women, tired eyes still lit with hope, I began to speak. Not as a victim, but as a survivor. I talked about the day Mason left, the night I built a crib alone, the moment my baby cried in the delivery room, and I knew, even if the whole world turned its back, I never would. The talk ended in long applause and tearful hugs. A young woman named Kelsey came to me, eyes misty. "You don't know this, but I was about to give up fighting for the baby I'm carrying. After hearing you, I think I'll try one more time." That night, after Isla fell asleep, I wrote the first entry in my old notebook in months. My story is no longer a tragedy, it's proof that justice can come when we stop staying silent. Since then, I've been invited to speak in many places. A shelter for abused women, a college workshop, a community gathering at the local cultural center. I have no title, no advanced degree, but I have experience and truth. More and more women come to Summit Haven just to meet me. Not because I'm anyone special, but because they see something familiar. Someone who's been hurt, doubted, dismissed, but stood back up, not to take revenge, but to live. Marissa and I started a new program called A Mother's Voice, where single moms are trained as peer mentors, sharing experiences, filling out legal forms together, writing financial aid letters, and, most importantly, making sure no one feels alone. One afternoon while preparing for the weekend's workshop, I found a folder on my desk. It was from a local high school, inviting me to speak to a group of 12th grade students about women's rights and choices in family life. I read the letter, looked at Isla playing with her stuffed bear, and smiled. The past didn't disappear, but it no longer defined me. I still lived in the same small apartment, still took the bus every morning, still brewed coffee in the old machine I bought secondhand. But I lived in freedom. Freedom from judgmental stares, from the shadow of demeaning words. Isla grew day by day, her bright eyes and gleeful laughter making the whole building smile. She didn't know how she came into this world, but one day when she's old enough, I'll tell her, with honesty, not bitterness. I won't tell her about the one who left. I'll tell her about the one who stayed. Because this journey, though born in tears, has become a path of light. And I know I'm still walking it. Not as someone who was left behind, but as someone who leads the way. Riley's story is proof that the greatest strength doesn't lie in striking back at pain, but in standing up, speaking the truth, and choosing to live with purpose. From a woman abandoned during pregnancy, she became a voice for those who had once been silenced, doubted, and forgotten. Riley didn't just win justice for her child. She inspired hundreds of other women to realize that the past does not define you. It's how you move forward that shapes who you really are.